Good morning. I just want to say we'll get started in a minute or two. There's still people coming in, so another couple of minutes. Good morning, everybody. If you can take seats, we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Steve Pulaski. I'm the moderator for this event. I'm at the University of Minnesota, where I have a joint appointment in ecology and economics, and it's my pleasure to introduce our various speakers and then to moderate the discussion. And we should have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. As many of you know, we as a society face a number of pressing challenges, not the least of which, or perhaps the most important of which, is to figure out how to live well and sustainably. By that meaning how to maintain the natural capital, which is important to sustain future well-being. So it's been 10 years since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was published in 2005, laying out the status and trends of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and noting that many of the ecosystem services on which society relies were being degraded. And part of the point of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was to try to catalyze effort to turn around those trends, to lead towards sustainable provision of ecosystem services and to maintain the natural capital necessary for that provision. We've just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the June 16th issue, so just the one prior to this, a special feature called Nature as Capital, which tries to summarize much of what's been going on recently and where are the new frontiers in natural capital, in the science, and as well as the policy and management and implementation. So one way of thinking about where we've been over the last 10 years is we've made rapid progress in the science, not nearly enough, but still rapid progress. There's been a widespread uptake of ideas. You know, this room is partly evidence of that. There were more people who wanted to be here than actually we had space for. There's been a number of new initiatives that have been started both in the public and the private sector. So the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology releasing the Sustaining Environmental Capital, the World Bank WAVES project, a number of initiatives that are more in the private sector or public-private partnerships, so the Natural Capital Coalition, the Natural Capital Declaration, and so on. So it's an exciting time in natural capital and ecosystem services, but there remains the fundamental challenge of making sure these ideas are implemented and they make a difference on the ground. And so part of what we're going to talk about today is the challenge of taking this to the next step and not just having this a scientific or an academic exercise, but really getting this into the mainstream of policy and management, both in the public and the private sector. So we're going to start with some opening remarks from Lynn Scarlett, and then followed by some comments by four distinguished panelists. I will introduce the panelists after Lynn's remarks, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions and answers. Okay, so I'd like to turn now to introducing Lynn Scarlett. So many of you in this room know Lynn. She's had a variety of experiences, both inside of government and out. She served as in the Department of Interior from 2001 to 2009, first as Assistant Secretary of Policy Management and Budget, and then as Chief Operating Officer, and Deputy Secretary of the Interior. And she was Acting Secretary of Interior in 2006. Right close to home here, in fact, in this building, she was the co-director of the Center for the Management of Ecological Wealth at Resources for the Future. And currently, she's the Managing Director of Public Policy at the Nature Conservancy. She serves on numerous advisory boards. Currently, she's chair of the Science Advisory Board for NOAA. And in 2014, she was awarded the Sustained Achievement Award of the Renewable Natural Resources Foundation. So, Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning.
Good morning.
What a great crowd, and how fabulous to be back at Resources for the Future, where I spent 4 really wonderful years. I am delighted to be here. Concepts of ecosystem services and natural capital are not new. They encompass the idea, of course, that natural systems provide goods and services that benefit human communities. The question before us is how to take that to action. What policy opportunities might enhance integration of natural capital approaches in decision-making about infrastructure, resource management, and service delivery? Now, the context for taking natural capital to practice is, number one, that we face aging infrastructure. Do we want to build into the past or into the 21st century? Second, there are performance limitations of existing infrastructure. One need only think Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and other events. Third, we face persistent and new challenges, such as those associated with climate change. And finally, of course, in the public sector, we have chronic public sector budget constraints. Now, all of those factors and more prompt the search for new ways to meet communities' needs and to sustain nature. Efforts to invest in nature solutions are gaining momentum and growing in extent and complexity. These efforts are a central focus of our work at the Nature Conservancy, our work on resilient cities, our work on oyster reef restoration, water funds, floodplain restoration, and much more. And indeed, we see ecosystem services and nature's capital as a key focus of this administration, its effort to develop guidance on ecosystem services. But significant opportunities exist to enhance the extent and effectiveness of those efforts. Fulfilling those opportunities, I believe, requires a combination of science, technology, and policy, and I'm going to focus on policy. I offer first 4 caveats. Public policy is an umbrella term that covers a range of different types of decisions. They include decisions on public spending, administrative standards, regulatory design, public goods pricing structures, statutory frameworks on priorities, goals, and permissible actions, and much more. Those different types of policies involve different mixes of players and require different types of science, technology, and information needs. For example, regulatory compliance contexts require different levels of scientific detail than a budget priority setting process. Second caveat, policy unfolds at multiple scales: local, subnational, national, and international. Third, of course, the devil is always in the details. For example, bonds to pay for infrastructure can vary in what's covered, payback timelines, cost-benefit criteria, and so on. Fourth, often when scientists think about ecosystem services, or economists, they think the challenge of getting traction and action is simply to get that science further honed. But in fact, public policy is fundamentally about values. And that means good policy requires public engagement and processes that illuminate those values, illuminate trade-offs, not just matters for science and technology. So with those caveats as a backdrop, I want to turn to the future of natural capital and supporting policy needs. There are many situation-specific policy contexts and needs, and at the Nature Conservancy, we cluster those policy opportunities for nature solutions into 4 main issue areas. But there are many other possibilities. Our 4 clusters include air quality. How can we use nature trees in cities, for example, to enhance air quality. Water supply and quality. What is the role of watersheds, wetlands, and green infrastructure in cities? Third, climate risk reduction. What is the role, for example, of coastal natural systems and floodplains in enhancing risk reduction? And then, of course, there's climate mitigation, the role of nature-based carbon solutions. Now, each of those issue sets involves different laws, different regulations, multiple levels of government, different private sector participants. That means there are no simple sets of policy tools to drive action. But there are some shared policy challenges across jurisdictions and across issue domains, and I want to highlight 6 of them. 6 recurring challenges because they point both to where the challenges are, but where the policy opportunities reside. First is the challenge of coordination across jurisdictions and among dispersed agencies. We need that coordination to optimize across multiple benefits and to enable green infrastructure investments at meaningful geographic scale. Yet current efforts often unfold as a set of distinct initiatives, rather than as an integrated suite of activities to address climate, energy, air quality, water supplies and quality, wildlife sustenance, and other issues, for example, in urban landscapes. This siloed decision-making limits prospects of exploiting co-benefits and combining multiple finance mechanisms. We also need better linkage to regional restoration strategies, situating, for example, urban greening into landscape-scale ecosystem protection and restoration. The concept of water funds, facilitated by the Nature Conservancy in over 30 cities globally, is one model of such linkage between a city's water security and investment in a watershed to protect and store that water. Now, embracing those landscape-scale opportunities requires more integrated infrastructure management and cross-jurisdictional partnerships. Consider one example, the Tualatin Basin in Oregon. There, stormwater and wastewater managers required new permits to meet EPA water temperature standards. Under traditional approaches, they could have met those standards by investing in refrigeration systems for a price tag of $60 million. Instead, working with EPA, they combined 5 permits into a single bundled permit. And using trading tools available under the Clean Water Act, they paid $6 million to farmers to plant trees along 37 miles of streams to meet the temperature standards. There are policy tools to facilitate coordination, tools like that permit bundling. Tools also include things like joint powers agreements, intergovernmental compacts, creation of special districts, and more. All of these allow multiple jurisdictions jointly to plan and raise funding. But let me turn to a second challenge, that of aligning incentives to help drive investment in nature's solutions. Take fee structures. Fee structures can affect decision-making. 3 decades ago, the city of Bellevue, Washington, in a pioneering effort, established a stormwater utility and inaugurated the first ever stormwater utility fee. The fees now are pegged to the amount of impervious surface and total surface area rather than simply road frontage. The fee structure, if you think about it, affects incentives and creates incentives for greening that reduce stormwater flows. But along with incentive structures, we often encounter a third set of challenges, the challenges of what I will call aggregation. Some, though not all, greening solutions require dispersed actions across many properties. Think of Philadelphia's greening plan. And many require aggregation of actions to scales that yield meaningful results. Think of living shorelines and dune restoration along coasts to enhance resilience. Success in that context requires the actions of many property owners. Incentives for living shoreline easements are one tool to bring about the aggregation of action across multiple properties. Let me come to a fourth challenge, that of financing. For both capital investments and ongoing operations and maintenance associated with nature's capital and green infrastructure. public policies can affect what investments are deemed permissible through bonds, grants, and other mechanisms. Financing rules often set forth payback timelines, and public investments also often require cost-benefit analyses. Policies about timelines and cost-benefit analyses can affect whether natural infrastructure options get a fair shake. And even if financing is available for capital costs, financing tools may not fund operations and maintenance. In the U.S., for example, the Clean Water Act state revolving loan funds can be used for land acquisition to protect watersheds, but they cannot be used for operating expenses. And that brings me to a fifth and corollary challenge to financing, that of risk management. There are two key types of risks that affect investments in natural capital. The first is technical performance risk and risks pertaining to uncertainty, secondly, about construction and maintenance costs. How much does it cost to build those systems? How much does it cost to finance their operations over time? Cities and engineers have much greater knowledge about the technical and financial performance for gray infrastructure. But the task here is not merely one of developing more technical and cost information. We need risk management policy tools, for example, performance guarantees and pay-for-performance contracts. In effect, such tools can shift risks to a third party, but of course they require some compensation for the risk taker. So I want to mention a final set of challenges. One is the challenge of metrics and standards, particularly in a regulatory context. Consider urban forests and their potential benefits. Benefits vary by location, by age of tree, by diversity and tree stand structure. Benefits also depend on long-term maintenance, not simply initial tree planting. Yet metrics for service life, reliability, and long-term performance are not well developed, especially with the level of credibility suitable for a regulated environment. But there's another dimension to standards that is often a limiting factor. Many regulatory standards are prescriptive rather than performance-based, and the prescriptions often do not encompass natural infrastructure solutions. So I want to actually conclude this very brief overview with the array of policies one could plumb. We could be here all afternoon. But let me conclude by saying that some policies now reflect more explicitly the language and intent of ecosystem services and natural capital. But several priorities further are shaping relevant policies. We do need to summarize those governance approaches that facilitate regional and landscape scale or watershed level actions in order to enhance that coordination that allows pursuit of multiple ecosystem service benefits and the corresponding financing of them. We need tools that strengthen performance accountability through a focus on outcomes rather than prescriptions. We need incentives that align with ecosystem service investments. And we need a tailoring of financial mechanisms to address risk and align investment criteria to ensure natural infrastructure options can compete. So I want to end with that notable philosopher, Yogi Berra. Many of you in the crowd are probably too young to even remember him. He once quipped that the future ain't what it used to be. This world is at a turning point as communities are rethinking the nexus of people and places, ecosystems and economies, nature and infrastructure. Policies are key to driving change, but there is no big fix, and there are many essential players. Success, in fact, may not be that one big fix, but rather, to borrow from Mao Zedong, 1,000 blooming flowers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Actually, before I do so, I'm going to make a couple of announcements. I want to thank the sponsors of this event, the Woods Institute at Stanford, and the Nature Conservancy, and also RFF for hosting us here, and other partners of the Natural Capital Project that you see up there, University of Minnesota, and WWF. Also, you see up here, if you're on Twitter, the hashtag for this, the handle for this is Nature as Capital, as you can see there. Okay, so let me turn now to introducing our four panelists who represent a wide range of experience in government, international organizations, NGOs, and academia. The first panelist is Mary Ruckelshaus. Mary is the managing director of the Natural Capital Project and has previously served at NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center as the lead of Ecosystem Sciences program. She was also an assistant professor at Florida State University. Mary serves on the Science Council of the Nature Conservancy, and she's a trustee of the Washington Board of the Nature Conservancy. And she is past chair of the Science Advisory Board of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara, and was also chief scientist for the Puget Sound Partnership, which is a public-private institution charged with achieving recovery of the Puget Sound ecosystem. Okay, so after Mary, we will have Ann Bartuska. Ann is currently the Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and has had a major role in thinking about ecosystems and markets and government's role. She was also acting USDA Deputy Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment, and previously Deputy Chief for Research and Development in the USDA Forest Service. So she's outside of her government role. She's also was the Invasive Species Initiative at the Nature Conservancy, and co-chair of the Ecological Systems Subcommittee of the Committee on Environment and Natural Resources of the White House National Science and Technology Council. She's also been the co-chair of the Sustainability Roundtable at the National Academies, and is past president of the ESA, Ecological Society of America. Our third panelist is Michelle LeMay. Michelle is the lead natural resource specialist in natural resources and disaster risk management in the division at the Inter-American Development Bank. And at the bank, Michelle has contributed to the design and implementation of public sector investment loans and grants in coastal management, marine conservation, environmental governance, sustainable fisheries management, and tourism. And in 2012, she led the development of the bank's Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services program, aimed at integrating economic value of ecosystem services into key economic sectors. And currently, she leads implementation of this program. Prior to joining IDB, she worked at NOAA on protected areas, marine protected areas, species and fisheries habitat. And then finally, our fourth panelist is Tom Dillon. Tom is the Senior Vice President for Forests and Fresh Waters at WWF. At WWF, he has established and led the Transboundary Conservation Program that became WWF's Greater Mekong Program. In the Amazon, he helped design and develop the Amazon's Protected Area Program, which has conserved more than 50 million acres of Brazilian Amazon. That's not enough for him, apparently. He's also played a leading role in developing the Terai Arc Conservation Program in Nepal and India, and worked on conservation in coastal East Africa, the Coral Triangle, and the Northern Great Plains. Prior to coming to WWF, Tom worked at the National Parks Conservation Association, the Wilderness Society, and as a ranger in the Mount Hood National Forest. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over now to Mary, and then we're going to progress through our four speakers. So Mary.
Thanks, Steve. Oh, hi, you want to do that? Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. This wasn't in my bio, but I was right after college. I had a fellowship right around the corner at 17th and Mass at what used to be called the Conservation Foundation that Bill Riley ran. And we were merged with World Wildlife Fund after that. But I used to come to these sessions here, so it's great to be back. And I guess I'm going to show a few slides. What I'd like to do is pick up on both Steve and Lynn's points and talk about how science and putting these concepts into practice has advanced over the last 10 or so years. Thank you very much. Oh, is it coming up? Yeah. So at the Natural Capital Project, what we do, and as Steve mentioned, we're a partnership of 2 universities, the University of Minnesota and Stanford, and 2 NGOs, the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund. And our mission is to test and apply these notions of natural capital or ecosystem services and find out what does it take in that type of information to have it really transform decisions. So what we've been doing over the last, our anniversary, our 10-year anniversary is coming up this fall, is applying these concepts of ecosystem services or natural capital in very distinct decision contexts around the world. So just testing this idea that if you put the information in the right kind of form, it can really make a difference. And it's a lot of spatial planning for restoration or development or climate adaptation are the focal areas that we've worked in. We've also worked quite a bit in payment schemes, like Lynn mentioned, around water funds. And then increasingly, we're working with corporations to look at how they can manage their risks. So I'll just highlight one example to show you what we're learning. We've been learning a lot about how these concepts can be put into practice. And I'll focus on Belize, which is a project we've worked on with the World Wildlife Fund over the past 3 years. And there are some really interesting elements of this story of why we think natural capital information really has transformed the way they're planning coastal development in this country. And I'll highlight a couple of these points. So first is the government. This is a Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute in Belize. It's an overarching convening body that represents all the ministries, tourism, finance, development, etc. They first did a very smart thing, and they focused what they cared most about in their coastal resources on just 3 key services. So tourism as supported by nature, fisheries for lobster and conch, and then storm protection offered by their reefs and mangroves and seagrasses. So all of those benefits that they decided to focus on, they all go through key habitats in their areas that they knew about very well. So mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrasses. So they decided to focus their coastal zone development planning around those benefits and those habitats. They also used a very smart stakeholder engagement process in all the keys throughout the country, as well as the ministries of these very diverse government agencies. So they had a good process by which they identified the many human uses of their coastal zone, and they picked those key ones that they really wanted to target for zoning, and that's listed here. So you can see it's pretty diverse list of activities. And this map, I wanted to just emphasize that it's a busy, crowded ocean, and this probably looks like this on many of the coastlines that you're nearest to. So there's a lot of activity currently in this area, and it really takes stakeholder engagement at the leadership level in the ministries and on the ground in the communities to help sort through what are the most important activities and where are they most important. And so what our science team brought into this was some modeling and open source software tools that we co-developed with these partners. And the core to all these models just really have this very simple relationship. So the models say if you have an activity in a certain place, how does that change in the ecosystem? Change the services that are accruing to people. And then most importantly, this last step is how does that change the value or the benefits that go to people from changes in mangroves or coral reefs or ecosystem or seagrasses. And the groups, it's really great. This is what happens when academic scientists and NGO staff talk with people who are actually going to be affected by the decisions. They tell you, what do I mean by the value of these ecosystems to me? And for many decision makers, especially in government, they do want monetized values. So they want Belizean dollars as part of their metrics. But in many of the communities and even in the ministries of the different departments, they also look at these biophysical metrics of values. They want to know, what are the landings of the spiny lobster in different places over time? How many people, how many tourists visit each place over time? And how much protection is how much shoreline is protected from erosion? How many meters might be lost or saved every year? And then the habitat, they want to know how much of it is functional. So value metrics are not just dollars. That doesn't resonate for some people in some decisions. It's very diverse. And these maps, I'm not going to try to ask you to zoom in on any of them. I just wanted to emphasize that maps also really resonate with people. They really like to see where are the dollar values or where are these other metrics, like the middle panel shows you tourism, visitation rates under these different scenarios that they helped us develop and we iteratively analyzed with them. So it really just helps them see spatially along their coastline where are these benefits going to be gained or protected and where might they be lost when these different activities are allowed. And what that looks like in the plan, which is now slated for final approval in the Congress in Belize, is that if you think about the whole country, these 9 panels, these pie diagrams, are just showing how there's differentiation, there's specialization along the coast about which benefits are going to be provided where and where can development occur. So instead of a coastal-wide, country-wide prescription about not cutting down mangroves, which as we know often is overlooked or there are back-around ways to get around it, they've now specialized. In certain regions, they acknowledge the mangroves are very important here because the people are there to fish or there's valuable property that needs to be protected from storms. So there's a biophysical estimate of where are the mangroves most important for offering protection to the shoreline, but there's also an assessment of value by people, as Lynn mentioned. Where are the properties most valuable and where are the habitats most valuable to local fishing or tourism value? So you see that it's not homogeneous, that certain regions specialize in providing certain values and others have other colors emphasizing. So that's, I think, one of the real benefits of using this approach is that you get honest and transparent about where are the habitats really providing benefits and where are the people and their values that are most important to the governments and the local communities. So challenges in going from here. So the plan, as I mentioned, has been voted on for approval. It has one last step to go through. But as we all know, and those of you who do spatial planning anywhere, the devil's in the details, as Lynn said, in terms of implementation. So there are some interesting barriers as the different ministries need to talk to one another about making sure there's coordination and they all know where are the zones in place along the coastline and what is actually going to happen in terms of allowing oil and gas development or tourism development. And IDB, Michelle will talk more about this. The bank has given a loan, a follow-on loan, to help try to rationalize transportation planning with this overall zoning plan. The capacity and ability to adapt and iterate as more information comes in about whether or not these habitats are providing benefits and are the people to whom those benefits are intended to accrue, is that actually happening? That is a real limitation that we're all hoping to work on, is to increasingly build the capacity so that the learning that's necessary can keep going. And then scaling examples are another big challenge. The bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, has now supported a similar project in the Bahamas and in several other countries around the region. So we're hoping that if we get the stories out about what's happening and what we've learned, that these approaches can scale more rapidly. But that's a big challenge. So that's one of these dots on this map. And I just wanted to emphasize that NatCap has been working with partners all around the world to try to figure out, just like that Belize example, but in payment schemes and compensation, in restoration planning, how do you include natural capital information, and what metrics and what scales do people want, so it really does make it easier to take it up in decisions. And I'll just leave you with one kind of closing finding that to me has been the most interesting and maybe makes it easier for us to communicate more about what these approaches really mean. And these are all examples of value metrics that people have asked us in these decision contexts to quantify for them and to map for them. So when people think about ecosystem service or natural capital approaches, it often gets reduced to putting a dollar value on nature. Or you've all seen those, how many billions of dollars of value is there in natural capital around the world. And those are great gee whiz numbers to get people's attention, but it's really hard to take that and do something with it in an implementation of a policy or a decision about where should I invest in restoring areas. So these sorts of value metrics, how many poor families are affected, how much erosion is reduced in terms of tons per year, what is the access to sacred places and what's changed under a different plan. These are the kind of metrics that I think are really resonating with decision makers, and it might make it easier for a lot of us to talk about these approaches and why they might help communities and decision makers find congruence in what their shared objectives are. So that's all. I'll just close with our mission that I think a lot of us in this room are trying to do, which is really we acknowledge the top line, which is that, of course, we all internally know and intuitively know that people's lives and livelihoods depend on nature. But if we can't show them in easy, accessible ways where and when nature matters, then we really won't be able to change decisions. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, and well, now I can see how jammed this room is from sitting in front. There are some seats here for those of you who are standing in the hallway. If you want to make your way in, I won't feel disturbed by that. It is a real pleasure to be part of this morning's session, and actually just to see how far the Natural Capital Project has come is just really remarkable to me, and some of the changes that have taken place just thinking about ecosystem services and environmental markets, and that's partly where I want to get to. I'm going to be taking a particularly domestic view and unapologetically maybe a little bit more of a federal government view from the context of where I sit and the work that we've done. But I'd like to start, though, because this is an anniversary of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, with a little story. And that is, I was Deputy Chief for Research, fairly new in that job. And I came in one morning, and there was this document sitting on my table, set of documents, it was about this stacked high. And I looked at it, and it turned out it was the MEA. And I looked at it, and I said to myself, okay, this is nice. This is a nice academic exercise. I really didn't know what to do with it. And just recently, I was challenged again by one of my ecological colleagues, an eminent scientist, who looked at me point blank and said, Ann, why didn't you guys use the MEA in your decision making? And I said, I had no idea how to do that. And to me, it was a good example of the interaction as you develop these things, as you develop the science, what's the use of it and how do you move it into practice? And I guess part of my challenge to all of you as you think about ecosystem services, not only the description of them, but how do you move it into policy? And I think we just heard between Mary and Lynn some really pointed examples of where it has to get into the policy framework. So one of the things as I reflected on this talk was how far we have come in the area of ecosystem services. We have been doing a lot of science over the years, and when I look back in the federal government, the EPA was an early adopter of the concept of ecosystem services in their Office of Research and Development. It's been a lot of time trying to capture What are those services? How do you track them? How do you monitor them? USGS similarly, and to a certain extent, our Forest Service research folks have also done that, building that scientific basis. And of course, the academic community and the others who in the NGO world who've been doing this work. But what has really been a shift to me, and I think it was reflected in the most recent ACES conference, for those of you who don't know, that's a conference on ecosystem services, very simple name, is that where we used, when I went the first several times, it really was a learning about ecosystem services. It was people presenting their research on services. This one was particularly about the use of the knowledge to apply it to practice. And over again, there were people who were demonstrating how practices were being changed, how policies were being changed based on that science. And I really maybe commend to you the fact that, yes, we have built a very solid scientific base, but now it's moving it into the policies that I think are critical. I think one of the wonderful things within USDA that happened through somebody who was very enlightened and surprisingly in the Bush administration, in that it came out of the Bush administration, it's been stayed in the current administration, and that's the establishment of an Office of Environmental Markets at USDA through the 2008 Farm Bill. And the reason for establishing that marketplace was partly because we were talking a lot about how do we incentivize the use of and the building into our agricultural practices and forestry practices of things like carbon and of water and of nutrient management. And to be able to move it into an incentivized approach, we need to do a few things. And this is, I think, where it's clear that the economic community have helped influence this. And actually, I think we were informed by the cap and trade on sulfur dioxide that came out of the acid rain years in, sorry, hate to say it, but it's already 20-some years ago. And that is that in order to really move into a marketplace and to develop move these services into a practical policy base, there are a few things that make sense to reduce uncertainty and provide a basis for exchanges and trading. And so things like establishing a common set of standards, establishing guidelines that allow you to then enter a marketplace or to capitalize on those services and to create that certainty and that consistency that is so important. Perhaps as most critical to this is creating a monitoring and measuring platform that everybody is abiding by. The certification schemes, for example, I think really does illustrate where if you want to have a certified wood product, having some common basis for that allows you to enter a marketplace in a reasonable way that captures those particular values. And so these particular tools is what has become what is the primary responsibility of our Office of Environmental Markets. They've actually been moving towards applying these in areas of carbon and especially tied to some carbon mitigation opportunities that we have now incorporated into our climate change program, but also water quality trading and what comes right out of the wetlands mitigation banking world, but there's a lot more opportunities to venture into the water quality world, wildlife habitat. And I think this has been a really growing movement where you can be able to create exchanges and being able to change practices based on that habitat. And so being able to move those areas forward is what our Office of Environmental Markets has really pursued. But the essence of being able to do that is the science that we have developed and the science that has come from multiple organizations. And that I think is something we want to continue to encourage. Most recently, we have, through the USDA Market-Based Environmental Stewardship Council, which we have created a USDA strategy for environmental markets that really touches on those points that I've made. What are the standards, the guidelines, monitoring, measuring, how do we provide consistency, but also then how do we use all of our USDA programs in this world of ecosystem services of environmental markets. A good example is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, who many of you may know is a very good way to access and incentivize private landowners to do certain conservation practices. And what they've been able to do using their Conservation Innovation Grant program have been able to develop systems in place for these kinds of environmental markets, but then using their programs like EQIP and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program or other incentive programs, taking that knowledge and actually then creating grants and loans to producers so that they can adopt those practices. Now, the issue that we have is how do you do that at scale? And we talked, and Lynn mentioned that earlier, is the scale of the policy, the scale of the activity. How do we magnify and really target those types of activities so that you do have a greater benefit and you do demonstrate some kind of influence in terms of your land management goals, your conservation goals. But all of this is, and the subtext to this, my message is, then how do you institutionalize ecosystem services and markets? And how do you make it practical from a policy perspective, and how do you make it practical from a program's perspective? So I go back to my MEA example. I got it, but I didn't see the connection between all of this information and the programs and the processes that I was implementing as a member of the U.S. Forest Service. And so what we have to do is be able to translate that, and this is where the dialogue with the policymakers is really critical, both at what scale. And so not only at the local level, which is I think something Mary just talked about, but also at national scales, and how do you influence policy. One of the great examples and that has come out that I think allows us to do this at USDA is the 2012 planning rule for the Forest Service. And if you look at that rule, there is an explicit mention that it requires the land management plans to consider the provisioning of ecosystem services. It actually says that in the language. That is very clear direction. We live and die by the planning rule in the Forest Service because by law, every national forest has to have a forest plan and has to update it on a periodic basis. It used to be 15 years. That's been shifting a little bit. But the fact that it says it in there, that means that the entire juggernaut of the Forest Service that deals with the national forest is now going to focus on how do you capture those ecosystem services in your plans. Now, of course, the devil's in the details. What does that look like? How do you do it? What are the guidelines? But that's all part of the process. We are very good at creating guidelines within government, but you need to have the incentive. And so having it in the planning rule is one of those major milestones that allows us to move that context or that concept into practice. And so it's making it real. And I guess that is one of the other comments that I have to all of you, especially those of you in the science world who are trying to communicate with policymakers. Not everybody gets this phrase we call ecosystem services. It's kind of like sustainability. Some of us have embraced it. We know it in our blood. I mean, it just makes sense to us. But it's a mental model that not everybody has the same mental model. So how do you make it real? Well, you make it partly real by describing these services in the way people understand it. They're concerned about pollinator health. We're concerned about pollinator health. We have now a new national strategy on pollinator health. It's an ecosystem service, but you don't have to belabor the ES part of it. What you're doing is talking about the importance of native bees to pollinators, to restoration. And that gets to people and they can understand it. Water quality and quantity. We have lots of regulations about that. People get that, and they can use their programs to help deliver that if we provide the particular incentives and the tools they need. And same thing with wildlife habitat. So these are, again, making it very real. Recreation, air quality, all of those are tangible descriptors of something, an ecosystem condition that organizations are really primed to help respond to. So I encourage you to think about it. I encourage you to always think about how we bring this into processes is what actually will make the movement happen. And then lastly, and the good news is, in order to get on top of this, the Council of Environmental Quality has been developing what is called the Guidelines in Ecosystem Services and Federal Decision Making. And we've gone through a couple of iterations on this. This is supposed to be coming out as a document here fairly soon. If you're going to see major change in the way agencies function, getting something out of CEQ that says, here is your guidelines, and we expect you to implement this, and by the way, Office of Management and Budget is going to help you support this, that really will trigger within the federal government a whole lot of actions. And since we also work so many with private landowners through our regular programs, we will also be, I think, challenged to figure out how do we use those programs to do the same thing. So there's a lot of movement, and I guess the good news is we built the science base, but we now are building the practice base. And that, to me, is going to really what will allow us to capture ecosystem service, to actually manage for them, and do something significant at a very multiple scales, but certainly make some shifts, I think, in how the lands and waters of the United States are thought of in terms of these services. So, thanks very much.
Good morning. Can you see me above the podium? I should have mentioned, this is always one of my greatest challenges. It's a great pleasure to be with you today to talk about recent advances at the Inter-American Development Bank in assessing natural capital investments. I'm going to talk today primarily about public sector investments in infrastructure. We're going to talk about it in an international context, so very different from what Anne just spoke about, yet there are quite a few similarities. I'd like to cover 3 points. First, give you a little bit of information as to who the IDB is and our decision process. Second, what we've done recently, and talk about an example of implementation at 2 scales. And finally, looking towards the future, speak very briefly about barriers for scaling up and some of the next steps that we see forward. First, some of the basic facts about the IDB. The IDB is a multilateral investment bank with 26 borrowing member countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, or LAC. We provide loans and grants to both public and private sectors for sustainable development and poverty reduction. That's our bread and butter. In some of these countries, particularly the smaller and more vulnerable ones, we're the largest source of external financing for the public sector. In 2014, we lent about $13.8 billion, of which almost 40% was infrastructure. So loans in transport, sanitation, energy, and so on. And we have an active portfolio of roughly $30 billion. We've made some progress since 2009. As you can see in this graph, we've increased our investments in renewable energy, climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as environmental sustainability, from roughly 5% of our total lending in 2009 to 30% in 2014. Our most recent advances have been through the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Program, or BIO for its acronym. In a nutshell, BIO is a small grant program, which we use to create opportunities and use the comparative advantage of the region's biodiversity for sustainable development and sustainable development and poverty reduction. One of our key focuses has been on the economics of biodiversity and ecosystem services and using natural capital approaches to strengthen decisions at each step of the project cycle, which I'll explain later on. We work through partnerships, which is another key feature. Our partnerships with the Natural Capital Project, with Resources for the Future, with the Conservation Strategy Fund, with Smithsonian, with the Latin American and Caribbean Environmental Economic Program, LACIP, have all played a key role in an internal transformation of the IDB, but also, just recently, an external transformation. With these partnerships, the BIO program is becoming a game changer for us. I just want to mention one of our accomplishments in our first year of implementation. We actually trained 140 professionals within the IDB in the economics of biodiversity and ecosystem services applied specifically to sectors such as transport, energy, water, and agriculture, because we felt that we needed to transform the way people approach the subject and understand the subject before we could actually develop pilot projects. And the training was very successful. Before we go into the example, let me explain the process the bank goes through to make investment decisions. And keep in mind, we make investment decisions hand in hand with our member countries. We don't do this together. Every step of the way, they are part of the decision. For every country, we have an investment cycle, which begins with every new government administration, when the bank engages in a country dialogue, usually with the ministries of finance. In some countries, it's the Ministry of Planning. We establish sector priorities that are reflected in a country strategy. The priorities are selected based on economic sector work, where governments and the bank analyze bottlenecks for growth and potential lines of action. And it's a real challenge for the bio program to integrate natural capital at this macro level, which is dominated by macroeconomists. The country strategy is updated every year with an agreement on loans and grants. And this is followed by project preparation and appraisal. And at the project level, we usually do feasibility studies, which encompass ex-ante economic analysis, an environmental assessment, the preparation of an economic impact evaluation plan. Again, not all that dissimilar to the process that the U.S. goes through to make public investment decisions. Now, this is followed by execution or implementation with monitoring tools for specific indicators, and finally, a rigorous impact evaluation. There are opportunities to integrate information about ecosystem services at every step of the way, and this is where we've made the progress in recent years. Tourism and transport are two sectors where we've advanced the most. Working with the Natural Capital Project, one of our activities has been to set out to understand the entry points where data on ecosystem services and their value could be incorporated in the investment cycle for roads and ports. We actually had someone from the Natural Capital Project work within our transport division with our transport engineers. She was a very brave person. And to try to understand what transport engineers actually need and how they could use ecosystem services and information in design, in economic analysis, in environmental assessment. And together with the Natural Capital Project, guidelines were developed for managing dependencies and impacts on ecosystem services. Here, one of the major lessons learned was that the specialists suddenly became aware that their roads, their ports, depended on ecosystem services. And once they realized that, they came out and said, yeah, tell me a little bit more about this. Can I reduce my maintenance costs, for instance, by understanding? So we published these guidelines, and now we're actually working on a proof of concept, because guidelines are guidelines. The implementation is a step beyond. So we're working on a small infrastructure program in Belize, which is a country, as Mary has mentioned, that has been very successful in incorporating natural capital in policy decisions, such as its coastal zone management plan. The IDB's country strategy with Belize identifies tourism and transport as sector priorities. And we started working on a tourism loan in 2014 and are about to complete mapping and assessing key ecosystem services for 4 emerging destinations. And we're doing this with the Environmental Research Institute of the University of Belize. This is the first time that for a tourism program, we've actually started with ecosystem services and assessment. Now, how will this information be used in decisions? Well, for example, it'll be used in the preparation of destination management plans with the participation of local management committees, which will include microzoning that takes into account ecosystem services and values. It will be used in the siting of public tourism infrastructure, in the market study to link ecosystems, ecosystem services, and demand for nature-based tourism. It will also be used in the ex-ante economic analysis to select viable investments, and finally in the selection of indicators for the impact evaluation, which is going to be very difficult. At the same time, the country's is embarking on a national transport master plan, which among other things is going to look at the connectivity between these different tourism destinations. This master plan provides the Ministry of Works with a unique opportunity to plan the transportation network, taking into account dependencies of roads and ports on ecosystem services. For instance, floods, soil stability, control of sedimentation, as well as potential direct and indirect impacts. In coastal areas, we expect to use the results of the NatCap work on the Coastal Zone Management Plan, for instance, to integrate with this transportation planning effort. I'm particularly excited about the prospects of incorporating this information that was generated in a capacity building program for the Ministry of Works, where the ministry will acquire a spatial data platform and analytical tools to assess scenarios that take into account potential trade-offs in natural capital. So we're going to actually train the transport engineers into taking this into account and developing their scenarios. I'm going to take just a few minutes. In fact, I think I'm going to skip the specific example. We've actually zoomed in on a specific area to demonstrate how these trade-off analysis can be done. What are some of the barriers that we've faced for using natural capital approaches as a multilateral development bank? 4 barriers come to mind, and you've all heard the previous speakers address them. The first obvious one is the timely availability of georeferenced information on ecosystems and ecosystem services at the resolution and with the coverage necessary for various phases of the investment cycle. The second important barrier for us is coordination, since sector agencies often work in silos and do not want to share information, and I would say even the Coastal Zone Management Institute is reluctant sometimes to share information. The third is incipient knowledge on ecological production functions, and the fourth and final barrier is coming up with incentive mechanisms for stakeholders such as ministries of finance to engage in natural capital approaches upstream in the investment cycle. So our way forward is to complete proof. Oh, okay. Did I miss? I think I'm done. Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is our contact information. We've just started a new blog, so I invite you to come and see what we're putting up on the blog and find out more about our program. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here with this distinguished panel today. And I think my role is probably to give a few examples of how the World Wildlife Fund is engaged with these natural capital tools, particularly overseas in developing countries. I'm going to steal a little idea from Michelle and tell you for 1 second who is WWF. We're a network of conservation organizations around the world with offices in 80 countries, 6,000 staff. I am from the US part of the organization, but I've spent most of my working career outside of this country, particularly in Asia, but also working in Africa and Latin America. When I started working in conservation internationally, We never got to talk to anybody except for ministries of environment and ministries of forests, similar to Department of Interior here. But over time, now we've broken into some of IADB's partners, like finance and planning, foreign affairs. And one of the main ways in which we've done that is having better arguments and talking about what matters to the core central governments. Natural capital valuation, whether it's about monetary, in a monetary sense or not, is clearly a really powerful way to do that. Also having just bigger visions. That, originally organizations like the one I work for were very focused on endangered species, then protected areas. It took a long time to get outside of those into the social and economic fabric of countries. And now that's, I think, where we reside. I also must say that it's been a delight to be a part of the NatCap project, Mary, and working with the University of Minnesota, Stanford, and TNC. But maybe before I get into my semi-prepared remarks, I will say I just returned this weekend from the Himalayas, which is one of my favorite places on Earth. It's also a very fragile place in which natural capital ideas play a big role and can play a much bigger role than they currently do. As I'm sure all of you know, Nepal underwent a huge earthquake, a mega earthquake 2 months ago. Fortunately, only 9,000 people died in the immediate aftermath. The reason for that is that the earthquake occurred on a Saturday afternoon. Students were not in schools. People were not in their offices. Most people were out at markets, or else probably a couple 100,000 would have died. But 14,000 schools were destroyed across the country, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of devastation. Fortunately, organizations like mine, with our NatCap partnership, have started to introduce tools that connect environmental conservation decisions with economic decisions in Nepal. And so we've been asked by the cabinet in Nepal to help them determine how to spend the $1 billion that has just been pledged by the donor countries in reconstruction. So that, where will gravel come from for rebuilding the many schools and homes that have been destroyed? Where will the wood come from? In a country that is fairly small, but with a population of close to 30 million, they don't have vast, untrammeled wildernesses like we do. And it's a major issue in that, they cause further disasters by taking wood from areas of steep slopes, for instance. What are the rivers that have the fewest ecosystem services that should be used for the massive amount of gravel needed for buildings? Decisions like that. So it gives me a sense of hope that we are being asked those kinds of questions, which just a few years ago, we would not have been asked that at all. It would have been in a rush to rebuild without looking at green reconstruction principles based on an understanding of how important is the natural capital and ecosystem services provided by them. I was also in Bhutan on this trip. Bhutan, for those of you who don't know, is a country to the east of Nepal. It's the size of Switzerland. It's almost entirely mountainous except for the southern part of the country, which is 300 meters in semi-tropical forests. And one of the issues that I was dealing with there was that the government has decided to set aside a free-flowing river. And they want to be the leaders in Asia on this topic. They want to serve as an example. And this small country has served as an example before, in that it created the first environmental trust fund in the world in 1992. It also, by the late 90s, had set aside 51% of its country in a conservation system. It also has declared itself that it will be carbon neutral forever. Interestingly, it is a massive carbon sink considering the population is only 800,000 people and 75% of the country is forested. The Constitution mandates that 60% of the country must remain under forest cover. But it's a poor country. And so it's amazing that they would say, we want to set aside one of our major rivers. There are 4 particularly large rivers that come through from the glaciers and are very important for India in particular for their agriculture. And one reason why it's important is because the number one source of revenue in this country are hydroelectric dams. The number 2 is tourism, and if you haven't been there, I recommend going. And so they asked WWF, they meaning the government, can we do some analysis about, first of all, what areas should be set aside for biological values? And then how to incorporate cultural values. And the country, as you may know, has something that's wonderful called gross national happiness. The 4 pillars of gross national happiness are education, health, good governance, and the environment. And so the idea of setting aside a river is partly about that 4th one, the environment, but it's to underpin the other 3, and it's an understanding that the environment can underpin the other 3. So the 2 options of rivers to set aside that came out both entail not building quite a number of dams. The one that we prefer will forego 3,500 megawatts of energy, which is worth $1 billion a year to Bhutan, so it's significant. The other will forego 1,000 megawatts of energy, which is also significant. The interesting thing will be, and a couple of the speakers were commenting on this, how important is the monetary side versus other benefits? And so now the questions that have arisen are, well, can we look much more deeply into the ecosystem service benefits from these rivers? Can we take that into consideration so it's not just foregoing 3,000 versus foregoing 1,000? Can we look at what are the ecosystem services provided to India? Can we get the Indians engaged on this topic? So I won't go further into that story, but I'm just trying to illustrate that the conversations are changing in countries where I work, where WWF works. One of our main questions about NatCap and our relationship in NatCap, about the tools that have been under development, INVEST, which Mary showed how we and the government and now the IADB are using in a country like Belize. But the question is, we've shown that at a small scale, we can change decisions. Can we change decisions and influence decisions at a larger scale, at the scale that matter in a world that is so rapidly changing? And 2 examples I would like to give from the public sector engagement we have are one in Myanmar, formerly called Burma. I spent a lot of time living in Southeast Asia, and Burma was always the place I wanted to go because it has the largest forest left in mainland Asia, well, outside of China, 100 million acres of forest, which is a lot in that part of the world. It has massive amounts of freshwater resources that are as yet relatively untapped. But none of us could get into Burma because it was a pariah country, of course, until recently when Aung San Suu Kyi was let out of house arrest 3 years ago, and now there's a democracy. But people still haven't had hope because they said, well, that country is run by generals who were involved in the regime before Aung San Suu Kyi was let out of jail. So what can you do? Well, in our first conversations in Myanmar, the president, Thein Sein, said to us, we know that we don't want to follow the path of countries near us, of countries like Vietnam, which have devastated their natural resources. We have seen the maps created through our NatCap partnership that we're at a fairly small scale. They're at a landscape scale about the forests on the border with Thailand. Can you do this at a national scale? Can you provide maps of natural capital across all of our resources in this country so that we can use them to plan where we're going to put production forests, where we're going to zone production forests, where we are going to establish new protected area systems? where we're going to allow new dam development and what type of dam development. So I heard how little time I have left. So just to say, we are engaged in that now. It involves the training of a lot of people in Myanmar. It's not just Stanford and WWF coming in and doing all this analysis ourselves. Similarly, in Mozambique, there's an initiative going on. I have the 5-year plan, Mozambique, right here. It just came out a month ago. And in it, thank goodness, it says, of the 5 priorities of the country, number 5 is ensuring the sustainable and transparent management of natural resources in the environment. The reason it says that is because at Rio Plus 20, Mozambique wanted to make a big splash. And they committed to incorporating an understanding of natural capital into all their planning across the country, partly because, as you may know, they have massive gas resources off the coast. And now they realize they have a chance to sit back a little bit, even as a very poor country, and plan and zone. And so the way that is now, we have embarked on doing that using tools of mapping natural capital, starting to understand the ecosystem services. So everything's not in the public sector. I had some other good examples to show and one, or to talk about. And one I would just say is, I mentioned protected areas as maybe the most traditional way to go about doing conservation. We are working on how to improve the protected area systems of entire countries. And the reason for that is that they're at the core of where most biodiversity remains. However, they're severely underfunded. You may know that in the developing world, it's estimated to need about $3 billion for the recurrent costs of all the protected area systems in the developing world, of which only about $1 billion exists right now. So there's a gap of $2 billion. And what's occurring from that gap is deterioration of these areas, deforestation, degradation of all kinds. So how do we quickly accelerate and change this finance issue? Well, one obvious way is exactly through showing ministries of planning and finance the importance for their economies, the importance for communities, the importance for the social issues that they care about. So we're doing this in Brazil, for instance, and that was when Steve introduced me, he mentioned this system that we've set up with the Brazilian government. It's actually not 50 million acres, it's 150 million acres of new protected areas in the Amazon, but the Brazilian government couldn't afford it. And so the international community set up a big fund that can pay for the gap they have while the Brazilian government increases its financing. So it's a large sinking fund, basically. But there were a lot of antibodies to that kind of thing, because for us to raise $220 million, we asked the Brazilian government to put in $800 million into this system over time. And they have a lot of other things to spend money on, of course. So 2 years ago, I was called by the Brazilian embassy here and they said, well, the ambassador would like you to come speak to him about this initiative you all are leading. And I thought it was for him to say, I love this. You know, this is great, because a lot of the people who I'm around every day think that this is really visionary. And so I got there and he said, so what are you doing? How could you think that a country like ours can afford, to set aside 60 million hectares of forest? And he said, what is that going to do to energy development in the Amazon? You know how dependent we are on new hydro. And thank God, through the Natural Capital Project, Dr. Derek Pennington, who is WWF and University of Minnesota, had done some analysis on looking into what can this system provide. And one of his statistics stuck in my mind. It was this system will, over time, provide 12% more water to the Amazon than it would have had under a business as usual scenario. And I said that, and suddenly he had a big smile on his face, and he said, okay, well, I didn't realize the environmental groups actually were practical like that. That's the exact kind of information that someone like me needs, and that I'm not the technician who is making the maps or doing the analyses. I'm the person who is talking to the governments mostly, or to other partners, trying to translate what is coming out of our partnerships with University of Minnesota and Stanford and others. I talked mostly about the public sector there. I'd intended to say something about our global partnership with Coke and how I've seen Coke evolve on this topic from really only thinking that water was important in their manufacturing facilities to understanding the much broader natural capital issues, or mentioning sustainability standards with commodities and how that is a driving way in which we can get the private sector to invest into natural capital. Lastly, maybe the importance of us working with major corporations in this country on, what WAVES is doing at the World Bank for governments, which is trying to incorporate natural capital into national accounts. Well, that's what we can do with the private sector on their own concessions, their own lands, their own businesses. Indicators of natural capital are essential for the major corporations of this country. They're starting to see that. They're starting to be asked that by investors. It's something that the environmental community should be collaborating to a much greater degree on. I won't say any more because I'm being told I have to sit down, but thank you.
Okay, I'd actually like to invite the panelists, actually, and plus Lynn, I'm going to stand here to come up. And we have until 11 o'clock for discussion and question and answer. Thank you. Okay, while the panel is getting settled, I'd like to actually start off with one. Most of our panelists actually spoke about, in a way, moving from the first phase of ecosystem service natural capital, which was more in awareness building and building some of the core science capabilities, and now getting to thinking about questions of implementation. How do we make, as Ann said, how do you make it real? So my question to each of the panelists is, if I force you to say, what do you think right now is the key impediment from making it real? And if you had the ear of Obama or the World Bank chief, what would be your one key message to them about how to overcome that impediment to make it real? So I don't know who wants to start. Nice small question for you.
Well, since
Yep, fine.
Didn't sound like. Well, since you used my quote, then maybe I'll just follow up on it. Well, I think part of it is what maybe will come out of CEQ is if there are solid guidelines challenging agencies to work together. It's not just about describing those services, it's really changing the procedures in which one operates. So what is the landscape which we're operating in? How do we define that? It's breaking down those jurisdictional barriers that Lynn was saying. And we can do that. And there's one, I pointed to ad nauseum actually. There was a new authority that Interior and Forest Service Land Management had called Service First that allowed 5 land management agencies to share their authorities to accomplish common goals. That kind of breaking down barriers. You're not going to merge agencies. And every agency has its own congressional committee that wants to oversight. But you can break down these barriers through administrative processes. And so the more we can do that would be one thing I would say within the domestic system. It is not on, right? I think that's
Yes.
now, can you hear me back there?
Yeah.
No, yeah, okay. But then actually, globally, I want to get it, if you would bear with me, on the, Steve mentioned the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, or IPBES, and there's a lot of ways to say it. But one of the things, I've been involved in that for the first 2 years as part of the multidisciplinary expert panel that created the governance and all the structures associated with IPBES. And one of the things that is very powerful about it is we have explicitly made policymakers a two-way street with what we're developing and hearing from them what they need. And so every assessment that's created, first although we're taking an academic approach because of the science, management is helping drive the topic that we're doing, and every assessment has a summary for policymakers. So it's clear, it's concise, it's crystal, it's simple, and it directly connects that assessment to what a policymaker may want. I think that is the kind of change that needs to happen as we develop these kinds of tools, thinking always of the policymaker, what they need to make their decisions, and getting them in the circle sooner than later.
Great.
Just to add to that, if I was given the opportunity to say just one thing to move forward with, I would say that from our perspective, our regional perspective, the concepts of ecosystem services and natural capital are still incipient in Latin America. And there's a real need to do two things. One is a massive communication campaign where working with NGOs and multilateral institutions, we could really get those concepts spread throughout. The other one accompanying this would be a capacity building program targeting ministries of planning and finance.
Tom?
I'll just build on that. I totally agree with the last two comments. But another angle, it seems to me, in addition to governments, and particularly in the context of outside the U.S., where there are a lot of governments that may not have much accountability and may have issues of misuse of resources or corruption, I think getting this information to people is really important. And so now that we have the wonderful communications tools that have been developed, there's a democratization of technology. There's a democratization of ideas, and we can get information out to people who wouldn't otherwise have had it. And so, while there's a lot of difficult algorithms that might go into the analysis that we're all talking about, a lot of the outputs are pretty simple in terms of maps, in terms of statistics, and I think we should be working in parallel with governments and private sector, also with getting this information out to the general public so that they have it, can put pressure on governments and decision makers, particularly when there are pending decisions that impact them.
As I noted, is this on?
Yep.
As I noted in my earlier comments, of course, there are so many levers to influence action. But since Steve asked for one thing, I would say just do it. There's nothing more powerful than experiential knowledge. The doing of it further builds the science. It further builds the technical experience. It also enhances an understanding, indeed, of the decision barriers. So I would say one thing, if you have the desire, find the place and just do it. Build that experiential knowledge.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo what many of my colleagues up here have said. What I would say is that it's not the science that's limiting, even though my science group will always find something really cool to be working on. It's in every case where we've worked. We always work with decision-making groups to help us define what's needed. There's a strong leader, an inspired and inspiring leader who's really pushing it. It could be at the local community level. As Tom mentioned, it could be in a government official. It's often several people. And once those people have seen the power of this approach, they are the best ambassadors to tell other people, their peers in private sector. None of us had much chance to talk about our private sector projects, but both TNC and WWF have great projects with private sector. So does NatCap. I know both of the banks and Ann's government everybody's working in public and private sectors, and if you have a strong leader who can then go out and say, this is what we did, this is how it helped us, then I think they'll really take off.
Great, thanks very much. So I'd like to open it up, and if you have a question, there's a microphone there, and we've already got a line forming, so go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Ariana Stettenbreyer, University of Maryland in NOAA. So I was recently at a workshop on coastal resilience, and I happened to be one of the few natural scientists there, and I was there with a lot of engineers, which was really fun for me. They think differently about the world, it turns out, than ecologists, and we were talking about the fact that natural systems are so variable. They're variable within a season, they're variable between years, and this was challenging for the engineers to think about, because they're thinking, well, if I'm doing a project, I put my stamp on a project, and then I'm liable if something goes wrong. And they said, what am I supposed to do in a natural system where things are more variable? And this wasn't actually something I thought about, the whole stamping process. So what I'm curious about is when we're trying to, yeah, go for it. I can talk loud. When we're trying to do this informing decision-making and our planning and our process, but we want to use more natural systems and ecosystem services, what are the mechanisms, maybe policy mechanisms or other mechanisms, by which we can try to deal with some of that uncertainty so that we can have confidence, we can make these decisions, we can opt for the non-built option where we know exactly how we planned it. How do we do that so that we can work with our colleagues who have to stamp things or have to commit to something and somehow provide more certainty? I know in markets we have things like discount rates that help to accommodate that. What are the other options? And I'm wondering if it gets back to that performance-based stuff that you were talking about, Lynn, at the beginning.
Ariana, I'll take an initial stab at that question. I think there are multiple things one can do to pull that engineering community in and have more of these solutions. So first, and perhaps this is anathema to the crowd gathered, it's probably valuable to think of these solutions not as completely supplanting some of the more traditional solutions. In some cases, perhaps yes, but in others, perhaps we'll see hybrids. And that can help to both build confidence but also abate some of the uncertainty. Secondly, I mentioned in my comments that there are policy tools for risk management and shifting risk to third parties to address technical uncertainty and so forth. So the utilization, the application of some of those kinds of tools. Third, I would actually say, on the one hand, you can look at that variability as uncertainty. On the other hand, you can look at some of that variability in natural systems as actually an asset, and use that variability itself use that variability as an asset for sort of operational utility over a range of circumstances. So it's a medley of responses. Hybrid risk management tools, shifting risk to third parties, but then seeing the degree to which you can turn that variability into an asset instead of a liability.
Hi, Ariana. I'll just add quickly that when we've worked with our own engineers who talk to other engineers on our projects, we have found that their approaches to building in redundancy and protection from that variability has helped a lot. So we've developed some hybrid approaches, as Lynn mentioned, in coastal protection, where we can show how marshes reduce the height that a levee is required to protect property in, for example, Freeport, Texas, and then right around the corner in Galveston. And the interesting thing is, as you say, the height of a levee that a marsh can protect is very different in Galveston than in Freeport. And it's because of all that heterogeneity you're talking about. So that has worked well and has satisfied engineers in at least a couple places where we've worked for coastal protection. Great.
I'm Joe Browder, and I want to say it's an honor to follow Ariana, who I think is one of NOAA's greatest intellectual assets. I've organized and led campaigns that have taken more than 1 million acres out of private development ownership and into the national park system in in South Florida, where turning nature into real estate is the most profitable legal industry. And so I have that experience you've talked about. And I have to say now, largely because of the way the climate debate has been engaged, even those national groups that focus on protecting natural lands have had their priorities so shifted toward opening public lands to energy development or supporting cap and trade or particular technology strategies that we do not have now the same asset base in the national environmental community that has experience in taking great landscapes that are privately owned, and which is most of the great landscapes left to be saved, and putting them into protected status. And I think that's an issue that really needs some thinking. Thank you.
My name is Sudeep Vyapari. I am with the National Council for Science and Environment right here in Washington, D.C. And first of all, I want to thank you all for sharing some insights on many matters that probably keep most of us awake in the night. But I have a question about, and that's that elephant in the room, particularly with what Tom shared. I come from India, and that elephant in the room is the population. I've had the chance of visiting Bhutan and see what was happening about 26 years ago, when they were still developing the biodiversity corridors. Yet, the reality is, because of the poverty, there is a mass exodus of Bhutanese and people from Assam coming to India and trying to engage in these professions, pretty much sitting on the sidewalks trying to sell sweaters. That's one big issue. Within the Indian context itself, there's a massive, aggressive, excessive urbanization. Two questions. That, number one, how do the governments or probably agencies such as WWF and others can send that message, the value of the natural capital, and why these exoduses are not probably the best means of leaving the places where they're supposed to be at. The second question I have is, also when I look at your model, there's a great insight in the inflow of how a system is being created, but what's the outflow here in terms of where do we create knowledge partnerships to teach a common person about what is happening with the natural capital? Any comments from anyone?
Who'd like to take that?
I'll
Tom?
make some comments. First of all, just on to comment for a second on the last speaker's point. I think there's a lot of opportunity for helping private landowners improve their practices. And there increasingly are standards, sustainability standards that are highly credible to enable that to occur. Whether it's, in Florida with sugar producers. Bon Sucro is the sustainability standard that has been created through a roundtable process of private sector, civil society, government. And, and there's great research showing how much it diminishes impact. And so, we could go on and on about other standards, but I don't think it's plausible for us in this country or in many other countries to shift the ownership of private lands to government. I mean, the politics are not there. And so it's more about how we can work with, so WWF, one of our main areas of work is the Northern Great Plains. And there, 90% of the land is owned by ranchers. And so if you were just aiming for environmental benefits, it would be potentially removing all ranchers. But that's not even remotely possible. And so instead, it's how do we help them produce beef in a more sustainable way. Producing beef is a lot better than putting corn or wheat on that land. And so I think it's through partnerships that are perhaps new for the environmental community but that are much more based in local realities and in economic realities are plausible, and that's where we need to be moving to complement what can be done in setting lands aside. So while I'm personally very involved in setting lands aside, also it's in complementing that, working with either the private sector or private individuals. And but on the gentleman from India, I think I had some great points about population issues. And one thing I would say is he mentioned Bhutan and people moving out of there. The Prime Minister of Bhutan came to the U.S. In March, and I led him around the country for 10 days, visiting. He had high media opportunities, met sort of all the leading magnates in the Bay Area, Tesla and Google and so forth. Many senior government officials here in Washington, the World Bank and GEF and others. And it was to promote this initiative that we have together that's called Bhutan for Life. And that is about conservation across the entire country. The reason he's personally interested gets back to your points, because even in that small country, they're seeing rural to urban flight occurring, which is common in all developing countries. So you wouldn't expect it in Bhutan. People think of Bhutan as the Shangri-La, but it's not. It's a normal country, of course. And so, you know, what he sees as an opportunity through conservation of natural resources are making these places pay. Now, they'll never pay to the extent may be needed, but making them small economic magnets. And there are a lot of, I think, very viable ideas and already great models for that. And I think that's exactly what organizations like mine and governments like that need to be focused on. India is a bit different just because the population is so incredibly large, and there are 400 million people who are under the poverty line. And so I don't believe in a country, a population that size, that conservation will be the economic magnet. And in countries like Nepal and Bhutan, that is possible. But in India, it would take some drinks over beers for us to talk about what my thoughts are on it. But I think you've hit on a challenge for all of us, and that if India destabilizes due to something like water insecurity, which is very possible, it is dangerous for everybody in the world, including us in the United States. It's a national security issue. And we should be, as a country, focused on helping make sure that Modi's successful, the new prime minister, and that India doesn't break apart due to the unbelievable pressures it has on its natural resources and population.
I'm David Foster, and I'm currently focusing on the use of natural capital to improve the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. Before that, I had a career with EPA and also spent about 20 years, primarily in Asia, working on a variety of environmental programs. I'm going to admit, when I first started in this business, I thought the big three, the pillars, were environmental science, economics, and law. And increasingly, and largely from my time spent in India, I found that there was that maybe those were necessary conditions, but not sufficient. And the primary fourth pillar, to me, was the need for trust, particularly when you're working with such a varied group of stakeholders, and whether that's in India or whether it's on the Chesapeake Bay, when we're balancing needs of farmers and watermen and householders and industry. I'd like to ask our panel whether, from your experience, you've also found trust to be a critical dimension. And if so, what can we do to help improve trust amongst the varied stakeholders?
Thank you. I think the trust issue relates to much that was in Mary's presentation and briefly alluded to by me, which is that ultimately decisions about resource use are not matters solely of science, but do invoke values and do invoke trade-offs about values. And consequently, those affected by those decisions have to be engaged, both from the standpoint that Mary highlighted to identify what their priorities are, what makes their hearts sing and or what they are worried about, but also so that they are partly in the driver's seat to think through trade-offs. So to that effect, I think putting a premium on collaborative decision processes is absolutely critical. If you look at Florida and its effort to work with ranchers to embark on what they are calling in Florida water farming, where the farmers shift from shunting water out to sea to instead holding it on their land and then essentially supplementing Lake Okeechobee as a storage basis. You had farmers that were highly skeptical. The government agencies are going to come in and measure how much water I have and traipse around and put monitors here. I'm not sure about that. But it was the collaborative processes that really brought that engagement and built that trust. And so I think processes like collaborative adaptive management, stakeholder engagement are absolutely critical, and at all levels.
And just to add to that, one of the areas I've been really interested in coming from the science world is the whole area of participatory research. And it takes various structures, and it's actually been, I think, adopted globally faster than the United States. But the basic tenet is you're building science based on questions that are posed by the stakeholders. You engage them up front, you engage them throughout, you engage them at the end in the assessment process and the monitoring. And so you build trust because you are in a collaborative process, but you're also then very deliberately building a scientific basis around a question that people have already bought into. And I think that's a real opportunity in the whole world of civil society, is how do you engage that civil society in your various structures. And I think building the science base is certainly part of that.
And just as a final note, I would say from our experience, trust is an essential element to start the dialogue, whether it's with the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Works. If there's no trust, the process doesn't get started. There's no sort of, you can't convince people solely on the basis of science. You have to combine various arguments. You have to have a good track record as an institution to be able to have that trust to get started. Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one second. I would say that there's also a mechanism in your own backyard of the Chesapeake Bay, the scorecard that Chesapeake Bay Foundation has and that University of Maryland has is, I think, a great example of building trust, because it's building trust in the data. And then it's communicating it in a way that people actually understand, using a report card A through F that has rigorous indicators, but people they can trust the credibility without knowing what all those are. And the creation of that was a multi-stakeholder process. It is now actually starting to be used in a lot of other countries, and I'm involved in that as well, bringing it out to other basins around the world. I think it's exactly that kind of mechanism that can create the kind of trust you mentioned.
You've really sparked a lot of energy around this topic. Obviously, it's really important. I have one other comment to add. We often think going into an endeavor, we need to convey, tell, influence, but we often forget that a critical part of trust building is to listen. And I am always struck by the work of a guy named William Isaacs, who wrote a book called Dialogue, in which he said to listen is to develop an inner silence. And I think sometimes going into conversations, we really need to start with that.
Great. So maybe we're getting closer to time, and there's a number of people there, so if we can have succinct questions, that would be wonderful.
I'll try and be fast. Speaking of stakeholders and waterways, my name is Allison Myers. I own an aquaculture company that removes excess nutrients from waterways by harvesting biomass. So I have two questions. I have a lot of questions, actually, but I'll limit them. One is a question for the audience. How many private sector are here? I'm just curious if y'all would raise your hands. Okay, good. We need to get more in the room, I think. So the question is, how do we do that? So that's a question for all. And I guess that's it. We're out here trying to pursue a practice, and but we're private sector. We're not used to government and policy, but we know we have a good goal, and we need some help in order to do it. So how can we talk to y'all, and how can you engage us? Thank you.
Hi, Lucia Wu from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. To manage natural resources, you need to quantify them. To manage them over time, you need to not only quantify but establish a certain baseline that can, from which you can detect changes. Now, given the rapid advances in today's technology and the scientific methodology with which we quantify natural resources, how do we establish these baselines, which often are totally absent in the policymaking, or if they are there, they're not sometimes reliably established upon?
Well, I'll speak on behalf of USDA because one of the things that we sit on are two tremendous resources. One is the Network of Experimental Forested Ranges. The first one was established in 1908, and many of them have continuous measures being made since 1910. And so that is a credible baseline. It's not as well known, and so part of our dilemma is getting those data out of the closets and the filing cabinets into the larger world, and we've been trying to work to that. But they cover every biome dealing with forests in the United States, continental and otherwise. So we're very excited about doing that. And then more recently, Agricultural Research Service has taken the LTER concept, Long-Term Ecological Research Network, to heart, and we've established Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network to do the same thing, to create this network of places that are already part of the selection process is that you had to have been sitting on 10 to 15 years of data already. And I think you couple the EFNRs, the LTERs, the LTARs, the NEON sites, the NOAA-RISAs, the USGS CSCs. We have this incredible network out there. Now we've got to get ourselves all connected. And I think you have a baseline if we could really take advantage of what exists out there.
You know, I sometimes look at actually the proliferation of data and am reminded of economist Tom Sowell, who once said, information is everywhere, but knowledge is rare. I think the challenge is how to take that work, both integrate it and make it meaningful. But there is another baseline challenge, which is for resource management, often you need data at sort of site particular scales. And so we often have data that's broader brush, extremely important and very important for examining long-term trends. But when it comes to that particular manager, we sometimes do actually lack that more refined scale of data. So yes, we have data, but not necessarily always just exactly what we need and not necessarily always integrated and as useful as it could be.
So I'd like to take, if we can get to the final two questions standing up, and then we'll probably have to cut it off there. So,
thanks. I'm Maria Bowman. I'm with the Economic Research Service of USDA. And this is sort of a corollary to that question. I heard a lot of this tension between we need more data, we have enough data, we need more data, we have enough data. And I think the participatory monitoring is a really great tool, as are these bright spots that people bring up as case studies that we put out there and say, look, it worked for this community. But what we've seen in the development economics community in the last 15 years has been this push for rigorous impact evaluation of things that are happening, which is very, very difficult to do at this fine spatial scale for environmental attributes that we're interested in. And I'm wondering if you foresee that that will be something that we're going to need to do more of, or that the community will push for. Yeah, that's basically it.
I'd love to hear your answer too, Steve. But yeah, I think your comment and the baseline comment are critical. And I think one thing we're finding is that building integrated data sets without a specific decision in mind is why it's been failing, because no one knows the right metric and the right scale, like you're saying. So what we've started doing is saving our work in an open platform so that people can see what we've done. And if we keep encouraging different decision cases to start building in the data at their scales and for their metrics, which is how people have to process satellite data in different ways for their questions. We hope that will help start building this shared data sets that stitch together, but it's complicated, and the reason it hasn't happened getting out of even file cabinets, like you say, Anne, I think is because there have been a lot of efforts trying to start from the data side, and I think you have to start from the decision side, the demand side, and that's really what tells you what metrics are needed. But Steve, on the development side, I don't know if you have other.
Well, no, you raise a great question about the policy impact and what do you need to know in order to prove that an intervention has actually had the desired impacts that you're aiming for. And I'm going to come back. There was an earlier question about uncertainty, and it is hard to design experiments in the same way that perhaps you do in education or health interventions. And so, part of the trick here, the challenge here is really how do we get information which is relevant and rigorous, sort of good enough for this and, for the particular context. Do we have the degree of reliability we need? So it is an ongoing question. It's a good question. Okay, maybe we can get to the last question now.
The last two speakers actually touched on the question. So anyway, I'm Jonas Epstein. I'm an ORISE Economics Fellow with the Forest Service. And I guess from an agency perspective, our culture has kind of been, in terms of management, once you've treated it, you've done it. And one area that we're trying to expand on at the national level is to provide strategic guidance for watershed investment partnerships. If you invest in healthy source waters, then there are obviously downstream benefits, and we're trying to get community engagement and private sector engagement behind that. But a major problem has been demonstrating the success of these programs. So touching base on the last few questions, how do you build economic justification for investment, considering that ecosystem services don't really lend themselves well to performance metrics, and it's really tough to delineate specific outcomes back to management actions over time.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. What I'm finding is actually there are so many different metrics you can use to quantify ecosystem services that you can match it to the decision. So the payment schemes are easy because the investors want to know what's the return on my investment. Am I seeing the water flows that I thought I was going to see? We're also seeing a lot of cases where you can look at nutrient loading or sediment loading. That's a service that's provided or not by some kind of green infrastructure approach, and that goes directly into decisions that have regulatory bearing. So I think that's a broader point that several of us have been making, which is it's not one size fits all. It's not putting a dollar value on a big, huge swath of nature. It's really saying ecosystems help people in removing loads from water-bearing streams, for example, or in protecting coastlines from erosion, and what are the metrics that would change an insurance company or a government regulator under the Clean Water Act that would trigger a decision. So I think it's not as mysterious as sometimes I think if you read just the academic literature we've led you to believe.
And just state the obvious, Forest Service meet ERS, you're both USDA, just meet across the street.
Okay, I'd like to bring this panel to a close. And first of all, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for coming and for all of the efforts that you are involved in and the work that you all are doing, taking Lynn's thing of just do it. Go out there and do it and prosper. And please join me in thanking the panelists.